Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to teach you one of the most confusing JavaScript topic, which is the promise object. Promises may seem difficult at first, but they're actually quite easy once you understand how they work. Basically, a promise object represents a pending state that will eventually be fulfilled at a later time. To give you an illustration, suppose you want to buy a new phone to replace your old phone. So you open a messaging app to contact a phone store. This is similar to how you access a variable or a function that returns a promise. After you send a message explaining what you want, you get an automated message saying that a representative from the store will answer your message shortly. This is similar to receiving a promise object. A minute later, you get a new message from a human representative saying that the phone model you want to buy is available for purchase. This is when the promise was resolved. Or, in a completely different scenario, the representative tells you that the store doesn't sell phones because the store you contact is a food store and not a phone store. This means the promise was rejected. This illustration shows how the promise object in JavaScript works. A promise is like the automated message that we saw earlier. It represents a pending state that must be fulfilled at some point later. The human representative saying that the phone model is available is similar to the resolve method, which shows that the promise is fulfilled. The representative telling you that you're contacting the wrong store is like the reject method. This means the promise can't be fulfilled because of an error. Now we are going to look at a typical promise implementation in JavaScript. Here, we can see that the p variable returns a new promise object, and inside that promise, we pass a callback function that receives the resolve and reject functions. Depending on the result of this promise, either the resolve function or the reject function will be called to end the pending state. To access the promise object, you need to call the variable and then chain that call to the variable with the then and catch method like this. When the promise is resolved, the then method will be called. And when the promise is rejected, the catch method will be called instead. Any value we put inside the resolve or reject functions like this will be passed on as an argument to the then and catch method respectively. Now if we run this code, you can see that the promise resolved message from inside the then method is called because the promise got resolved. Now if we change this isTrue variable from true to false, like this, you can see that the promise is rejected because the catch method is executed. This is because the promise got rejected. The promise object was created to replace the use of callback functions in certain situations. By using promises, the code we write will be more intuitive and maintainable. Going back to the contacting the phone store illustration, let's create an example that shows how to handle the situation using callbacks. First, we declare the two variables required for the situation. They are isPhoneStore and isPhoneAvailable, and both contains the value true. Next, we write a function to process the message. This function will imitate the promise pattern by using two callbacks for resolve and reject, but they are implemented using callbacks. Based on the values inside these two variables, either the reject callback function or the resolve callback function will be called from this process message function. Now that we have the function, let's call it. And we're going to pass two callback functions, and they're just going to log the results. Now, if we run this code, you can see that the resolve callback function is called because of these two variables are true. Now let's say we change the isPhoneAvailable variable to false. And now because the isPhoneAvailable variable is false, the reject callback function gets called. The same is true when we change the isPhoneStore to false. Now the reject callback function from the first if block is executed. Alright, now that we've seen a working callback example, let's rewrite this code to use promises instead. The first thing we're going to do is that we are going to remove these callback parameters, and then we're going to return a new promise from this process message function, and then we put the resolve and reject functions inside the callback of the promise, and then we're just going to put the if-else conditions inside the promise. I'm going to change resolve callback with resolve, and then the reject callback with reject. Alright, so now we have the process message function using promises. The next step is that we need to change the call to the process message function. The first thing we're going to do is that we're going to remove the arguments, and then we're going to add a chain to the .then method, then chain it to the catch method. Now we only need to put the callback function inside these methods like this. Same thing with the catch method. Alright, so now we have the process measures function using promises. And if we run this code, here you can see that the code returns the same output as when it's using callback functions. Now when we change these variables to true, we can see that the resolve function gets called. And here is a screenshot of the comparison between callbacks and promises side by side. Here you can see that when we use the then and catch methods, there's a clear order of steps to do instead of when using callbacks where we're just putting whatever the next process inside the callback function. As I've mentioned before, the promise object is created to replace callback functions in certain situations. And if you see here, even the promise object requires a callback function as its argument to run some code. And then when we use the then and catch methods, we also need callbacks. This means promises don't eliminate the need for callbacks entirely. For example, suppose you have 3 functions that need to run sequentially from 1 to 3. Alright, now we have 3 JavaScript functions that need to run sequentially from step 1 to step 2 and step 3. When using callbacks, this is how you would run these functions. Here you can see that we need to pass the next function inside the previous function, and this kind of code is famously known as the callback hell. And this code pattern is just hard and messy to read. By using promises, we can rewrite this code into this. Here you can see that inside each function there is a promise object being returned. Now when we want to call the functions, we can just call the function and then put the then method before we call the next function. And this is just much better than when we are using the nested callback patterns like this one. In a real-world project where you have many lines of code inside the callback functions, using promises provides a massive gain in your ability to read, extend, and maintain the code. But if you're running code that doesn't have to wait for certain processes, then you can use callbacks just fine. For example, when you're using one of the array methods like for each, you can use a callback function just fine. More than just replacing the callback pattern, the JavaScript promise object also provides some methods that you can use when you're dealing with multiple promises. For example, suppose you deal with 3 different promises in your project like this. Now you need to make sure that all 3 promises are resolved before you move to the next step. Knowing what we know about promises, we can chain the promises using the then method like this. In this example, each then method returns another promise, and this creates nested callbacks. This is exactly the type of code that we want to avoid by using promises. So instead of using nested callbacks, we can use the promise@all method instead like this. The promise_all method accepts an array of promises, and when these promises are resolved, the messages or values returned by these promises will be returned as an array. And if we save and run this code here, you can see that the messages variable is an array returning the values returned by these promises. When one of the promises is rejected, then the all method will immediately stop any further process and return the first rejection it encounters. For example, suppose we change the first promise from resolve to reject and then run this code. You can see that the error message from the first promise is immediately returned from the catch section. The allSetLet method works just like the all method, but instead of stopping after the first rejection, the allSetLet method will continue to process all promises and then return the result as an array of objects. Suppose we change the all method here into allSetLet like this. You can see that the return value is an array of objects. You can see here that the object contains status and reason when the promise is rejected, or value when the promise is resolved. You can use these values however you wish in your code. When running the allSetLet method, you can remove the call to catch method because the promise will never reach that section. The promise will always be resolved. You should use this method when you need to know the result of each promises, whether they are rejected or resolved. The promise_any method returns the first resolved status from the promises you pass as its argument. If we run this code here, you'll see that 200 is returned because the first promise that got resolved is the second promise here. When all promises are rejected like this, then the any method will return an error saying that the all promises were rejected. The promise raise method is just like the any method, but instead of waiting for the first resolved status, the raise method will wait for either rejected or resolved status. When we run this code here, you can see that the first error returned from the first promise is immediately returned by the raise method. You can use this method when you need a single promise to settle, no matter if the result is rejected or resolved. As you can see, these 4 methods of the promise object provides you with a powerful composition tool that helps you decide how to handle promises in your project. And now you've learned how the promise object works in JavaScript. A promise is easy to understand once you get the 3 states that can be returned by the promise object, which is pending, resolved, or rejected. You've also learned how promises can be used to replace callbacks, when to use promises instead of callbacks, and how to use methods provided by the promise object to handle many promises in your code. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I will answer them when I can. If you like this video, consider subscribing so that you can get notified when I release a new one in the future. Bye!